Alrighty, everyone. Welcome back to the Dank History Show. And in case you missed us last week, we are a show that focuses on the danker and doper sides of history. I'm your host, Bradley Cooper. Normally we have Katie Cooper with us, but tonight she is sick, so it's just going to be me guiding you all on a path towards dankness. So basically what this show is about, for the y'all who don't know, is we focus on the more interesting side of history. So we're not going to try to focus as much on dates, but we're going to focus on really interesting people, events, and also how it connects to how we live today, because everything that we do today and everything in our society is in some way tied to a past event. So that's what our show is about. So today we're going to talk a little bit about a time long ago. A dark time. A time when the Empire ruled all. Actually, no, it was after the Empire. Anyway, so we're going to be talking today about the Dark Ages. So when you think about the Dark Ages, there are a couple of images that come to mind. You might think of a group of knights, jousting. You might think of them going around slaughtering peasants and destroying villages and burning places. You might think of religious fanatics burning people at the stake for saying that, what's a good example? For saying that women should be allowed to read, or that witches should be permitted to live, or something like that. You may think of a lot of disease, or you might think of that famous Monty Python sketch in, I believe it was The Holy Grail, that movie, where the peasants are saying, how can we tell the difference between who's the king and who's the peasants? And one of them says, because he's the only one not covered in, well, he uses the S word, which we can't say on the radio, but, poop. So that's typically when people think of the Dark Ages, they don't have a very positive view of it. And that even goes together with the name. I mean, Dark Ages sounds like something that wouldn't be very enjoyable. It doesn't sound like it's filled of knowledge or intellectualism. It sounds like a very dark, troubling, violent time. So another view of the Dark Ages is that there was a lot of illiteracy, there was a lot of religious persecution, and more specifically, the fact that the Roman civilization had been left in ruins just put society back by hundreds of years. And this idea has been popularized by all sorts of things. It's been popularized by a lot of movies. It's been popularized by a lot of video games. You might see that in like the Assassin's Creed video games where it's just a horrendous time, and the only enlightened people are this group of assassins, which never existed. But the problem with all these views is that they're not quite accurate. So, in order to get to the bottom of this, I want to talk a little bit about what led people to start thinking this way about the Dark Ages, and what the Dark Ages actually were. And then I want to talk a little bit about, some civilizations during the Dark Ages. So where did this idea get started? Well, it really happened pretty quickly into, one might say, the Dark Ages. For example, there was this guy in the 1300s whose name was Francesco Petrarch. He was an Italian scholar, and he complained that the Latin literature of his day, the type of literature that people would write in Latin, he complained that it was of terrible quality. He complained that the writing was bad, that no one knew how to write in Latin, and just in general, it sucked. And he referred to his time that he was living in as the Dark Ages. And even though he was the first to say that, many people afterwards picked up on that idea. For example, during the Renaissance, which was basically took place in Italy around 1400 to 1500, there were a lot of people who looked back on the old Greek and Italian works, and they said, well, this stuff is really beautiful. We love the architecture, we love the statues, but the stuff nowadays kind of sucks. So we must be really living in the Dark Ages. And a lot of them were also humanists. And what humanists meant is that they want to focus more on the human aspects of things. Like they want to focus on the human experience. And you see that a lot in Renaissance paintings, that it will be very much focused on the individual. And humanism back then doesn't mean the same thing as it does now. When we think of humanism now, we think of something similar to like atheist or secular ideology. But back then, it didn't have that connotation. In fact, many of the Renaissance painters and thinkers were incredibly religious. But the Renaissance people, they planted the seed of the Dark Ages being a bad time, and then the Protestants took that and ran with it. The Protestant Reformation, for those who may not be aware, was a split that occurred between the Catholic Church and this other group, which would eventually become known as the Protestants. It first began with a German guy named Martin Luther, who disagreed with the Pope and the Catholic Church about many doctrines and theologies. And it continued with people like John Calvin. And what the Protestants did is they wanted to really cast the Catholic Church in a bad light. So one way they did that is they thought, well, all the centuries before us were dominated by the Catholic Church, at least in Western Europe, and they believed it was a very violent time and filled with radicals and filled with all these, inquisitors burning people at the stake. So they said, well, that was the Dark Ages. And then other groups continued in that same vein, like during the Enlightenment, which was in the 1700s, a lot of thinkers began to say, like, that was a period of great intellectual darkness. We didn't know anything, whereas now, today, we are in the era of enlightenment. We are much smarter. We're going to rule by reason and not by all these dark superstitions. And one caveat I want to say before we get into the specifics of the Dark Ages is that this type of attitude is very common. You see this in people whenever they talk about something from the past. They always refer to it as being this really stupid, dark, oppressive time where it was just a bunch of complete morons who were just, thought rain came because the god sneezed or something like that. And so people have a tendency to look at everything that's in the past as being bad and stupid, whereas we're more enlightened and we're smarter. And the problem with that mindset is it can be easily disproven just by looking at the amount of people killed in wars between this last century and the centuries before. Like World War I and World War II combined killed more people than almost any other war in the past. So we as humans have always had similar problems, and it's really, it's really close-minded to look at anything in the past and dismiss it automatically. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what the Dark Ages actually were. And that's pretty difficult because with all these historical terms, and this is a problem with a lot of things from the past. Like on an old show, Let's Talk Dinosaurs, which used to be around here at Horizon Radio, we talked about how dinosaurs, it's very tough to define what they actually are, what their species is. It's hard to define if we find a new dinosaur bones, if they are actually a dinosaur or not. It's hard to define like what era they were in and what those eras were like. And the same really applies when you get to human history, especially the Dark Ages. So traditionally, people have defined the Dark Ages as being like the entire medieval era, from 500 to 1500 AD, so about 1,000 years. But nowadays, most people push that back and say, well, it's really more the early medieval era, from like 500 to 1000. And one reason people changed and started referring to it more as the early medieval period is because we know that from about 1000 to 1500, there's all these beautiful pieces of architecture that are created. There are all these big countries that get founded. So people tend to be like, okay, well, society seems to, at least in Europe, that's this Dark Ages, the term Dark Ages is incredibly Eurocentric, and we'll have to get into that later. But so people are like, okay, well, the time right after about 500 to 1000 or 1066, that was the really, really bad times. So why did they think it was so dark? Well, in order to understand that, we have to look a little bit at the Roman Empire. So a lot of people say that the official beginning of the Dark Ages is the fall of the Roman Empire. And whenever they say that, they are both right and absolutely, completely, totally wrong. So the only thing that really fell in the 5th century, about 476 specifically, was the western half of the Roman Empire. The western half of the Roman Empire was basically was Spain, France, England, Italy, and a little bit of the Balkans. And the eastern half actually continued until the 1450s. And these two parts of the Roman Empire had been officially separated. They were two almost completely different nations, or I guess, empires and nations is really hard to define what makes them different, but they were two different empires. And they existed side by side, and the western half had some big, big problems. And the Western Roman Empire really began to decline in the 300s and 400s, and the reason for that is, well, a lot of things. One is that there were about 16 revolts from the space of 406 to the official fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. So imagine if there was like a civil war in the U.S. like every 5 or 10 years or so, and you get an idea just how chaotic things were. And the reason for that is that the Western Roman Empire had incredibly declined. There were all sorts of people jockeying for power. There were constant economic downturns. And there was a little something called the Great Germanic Migration. And what that is that in the 300s, many Germanic tribes who had previously lived, in Germany or further east in places like Poland or modern-day Poland and Russia, had begun coming west towards the Roman Empire. And they came west for a variety of reasons. One was climate change. The Earth was cooling significantly, so these areas were much less habitable. So when the areas are much less habitable, you want to, migrate to areas that are a little bit warmer. And so that was one reason they came. Another reason was that these Germanic tribes had been under attack for some time from another group called the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people group that were very good horsemen. They were known specifically for their ability to ride and shoot bows from their horses. And they were highly, highly destructive. And they weren't really big on, building these great, civilizations or architecture or anything like that. Their main goal was just get in, raid an area, take the resources, move on. So a lot of these Germanic tribes had to flee west to just avoid getting slaughtered by the Huns. And specifically, some of these tribes that came west were the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and yes, that is where we get our word for vandalism, as well as other groups like the Franks and Alemanni and such. And these groups began to settle in the Western and Eastern Roman Empire, respectively. Now, Rome had lots of experience with moving people groups around. For example, when they conquered an area, they would often take a whole bunch of those people and just export them over, essentially, to another part of the empire. Or they would enslave a lot of people if they conquered a region. For example, Gaul, which is modern-day France, they just slaughtered and enslaved probably about a third of the population. But Rome was pretty experienced, in other words, with moving around populations, and I mean that in both a bad and good way. They were fairly good at integrating people into the Roman Empire. Well, when these Germanic tribes come onto the scene in the 300s, 400s, things change a bit. So, when the Goths first arrived, for example, in the eastern sector of the empire, the Romans didn't really know what to do with them. They essentially kept them basically sequestered off just outside of Roman territory. And these people, the Goths, they were starving, so the Romans really took advantage of that. They would get them to sell their kids into slavery just so they could get food to eat and stuff like that. And they would promise that they would let the Goths in and give them land and food, but then they refused to do so. So basically, after a while of this, the Goths just got sick of it, and they revolted. Now, normally the Romans would be able to put down a revolt like this pretty easily. But both sides of the empire, both the western and eastern half of the empires, had become much weaker. Their armies weren't as big as before. So it took a long time for them to react. But when the Romans eventually did put together an army, they met the Goths in battle outside of Adrianople, and that's in modern-day Turkey, and it pretty much turned into an absolute slaughter. For one of the first times in a long time, the Roman army was completely outmatched, and they were cut down almost to a man. The Roman Emperor, what was his name here? Emperor Valens was killed in battle. So that was a major, major blow to Roman morale, and it showed that a Roman mismanagement of a migration crisis could cause big problems. And these problems would continue because the Romans, both the Western Roman and the Eastern Roman Empire, didn't really know what to do with all these people groups, so mostly they would use them as mercenaries. They would say, okay, we'll hire you to go fight that other barbarian. I use the term barbarian very loosely because, that's the term the Romans would have used, but I don't mean it realistically because, defining what is a barbaric civilization was a civilized civilization, that's often like, that's often steeped in all sorts of, racism and imperialism and stuff like that. So, anyway, these groups arrived, and the Romans would eventually try to get them to settle on Roman land. So they would live sort of pseudo-independent little kingdoms or tribes established within the Roman Empire. But there's a couple of problems with that. And one is that when you establish all these groups within the Roman Empire and you're hiring them as mercenaries, it's very easy for any general to hire them and say, hey, you work for me, let's go make me emperor. Because these mercenaries don't have any sort of allegiance to Rome as an empire, as an idea. They have an allegiance to the person who's paying their bills. So what would often happen is that a single Roman general would decide that he wanted to be emperor, hire a whole army of these people, go to war, revolt, and sometimes they succeed, sometimes they wouldn't. But all these constant revolts caused huge, huge issues. And also, whenever these groups would get angry or they'd be mistreated, for example, the Visigoths were continually mistreated within the Roman borders. Like, I'm trying to remember what his name is, but I'll remember it in a moment. But there was this one Visigothic leader who constantly wanted to be a Roman general and get some land for his people. But the Romans continually refused to give it to him. They continuously put him in incredibly dangerous situations where a lot of his men would get killed. And eventually got sick of it, and in 410, Alaric, that was the name, King Alaric of the Visigoths just completely sacked the city of Rome. And that had not happened in probably about 600 years. So that was an immense moral blow to the Romans. And for the first time, they had to acknowledge that they were not invulnerable. And this process continued on and on and on to the point where Rome was sacked pretty regularly. And what eventually brought the Western Roman Empire to an end is in 476, when a guy named Odoacer, who was a Germanic mercenary, he decided to revolt. He took down the Roman emperor, whose name was Romulus Augustulus, which means little Augustus, who was only 16 years old. And Odoacer decided, well, it seems like the emperors are always getting killed or castrated or sent off to die on exile, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to declare myself as the king of Italy. And that's what he did. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was done. And after that, that's when people believe that the Dark Ages began. Because after that, the western half of the Roman Empire, not just Italy, but other parts like France and Spain and Britain, they were all taken over by these largely Germanic groups. Although there were some groups from Iran and places like that. And like I said before, it's really Eurocentric and even Western European-centric to call this period the Dark Ages because the Eastern Roman Empire was still around. They were in the Balkans and Greece and stuff like that. And also, the idea of the Western Roman Empire never really died out even after Rome fell. And we saw this either in little regions that existed under Roman law or in people who tried to revive Rome, which that happened constantly. So, with that all in mind, we have to ask ourselves, was this time period really so bad after the fall of Rome? And, well, it depends. Like, obviously many people in the Renaissance and the later periods, they adored the Roman period. They thought of that as the height of European civilization. So anything that disrupted that, they considered that bad. Interestingly enough, this is why we see some stuff that's called Gothic architecture versus classical architecture. For example, if we ever see like those big cathedrals that have all those big, huge spirals, they call it Gothic because they're saying it's a Germanic style as opposed to a Roman style. Just an interesting little side I thought of. So back to the main point, was this really such a bad time? Well, first of all, we need to get a few things straight. The Roman legacy never really disappeared, even after the Western Roman Empire as a political unit was destroyed. In fact, the Roman system itself was really just replaced by the Catholic Church. For example, when the Ostrogoths eventually kicked Odoacer out of Italy and took it over for themselves, they pretty much let the Catholics and the papacy run things in Italy by themselves. And that was even though the Ostrogoths were not Catholic. They were actually a different branch of Christianity called Arianism. To explain that will take a lot of time, but just the basic gist of it is Arians believe that Jesus was a creative being instead of being literally God, like the Catholics and most Orthodox Christians believe today. And we'll talk a little bit more on that in another episode. So another thing to remember about this period of the Dark Ages is that many of these so-called barbarians weren't really barbarians. I mean, they didn't, when we think of barbarian, we think of a shirtless guy, big beard, maybe he's got an axe, he's probably screaming, he probably drank a whole lot of mead. Well, these barbarians, quote unquote, probably would have looked very much like Romans. I mean, they lived in Roman areas, they'd been influenced by Roman culture, they probably wore Roman clothes, drank Roman drinks, they even basically had the same religions as the Romans, Christianity. And another thing to remember about this time period is that even though Latin literacy did fall, and it definitely did fall during this period, there were still other people who tried to keep that legacy alive. For example, monasteries began to pop up all around this Western European world, and in the Eastern world too. And one of the first monastery orders was started by a guy named Benedict of Nursuria, who founded the famous Monte Cassino monastery in Italy. And this is a very famous place. It's been around since the 400s. You can still visit it today, although a lot of it was destroyed during World War II. And he founded the Benedictine order of monks. And these monasteries would largely try to keep alive all the old Latin works. So stuff by people like Virgil and Plato, for example. Go back to the Greek part. And also, of course, just keeping alive religious texts as well. And another thing that happened in the Dark Ages is that there were some technological developments. For example, there were lots of people who began to develop agricultural inventions to help make farming easier. The heavy plow, for example, was invented a little bit before 1000 AD, and that made food production a lot easier. And when food production gets better, then the population grows. Other inventions were the horse collar, which helped distribute the weight around a horse more evenly so they could pull larger carts. So there were lots of interesting things going on in the Dark Ages. And one thing I want to go back to is that whenever the term Dark Ages is used, people are almost always referring to Western Europe, whereas the rest of the world wasn't necessarily having that much of a bad time. For example, there were other nations that were doing incredibly well. Like I mentioned before, the Eastern Roman Empire, which ran from the Middle East to the Balkans, was, they kept alive most of the old Roman stuff, and they had a little bit of a renaissance themselves. For example, during the 500s, under an emperor whose name was Justinian, he managed to reconquer a lot of the old Roman lands. For example, he managed to reconquer North Africa, Italy, and little parts of Spain. And also, during his reign, they started building the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. And if that, for a more familiar term, you might know that as the Blue Mosque in modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. So the Eastern Roman Empire was doing pretty well. And also in the Middle East, there was a new civilization rising, and that was Islam. So in the 600s, there was this guy named Muhammad, and he claimed to have these visions from the Archangel Gabriel that was supposedly gave him a vision of a new religious message. Well, not necessarily a new religious message, because in their mind it was sort of repeating what had already been said before. And he recorded that into the Quran. Well, he probably himself didn't write it, but he spread it orally, and then other people did. That's just how people did things back then. And from there, this religion rapidly took over the area that's now modern-day Saudi Arabia. And then they struck out all these tribesmen and went to war against the Eastern Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And they rapidly conquered all of Persia, a lot of the Eastern Roman Empire, which by now a lot of people would call the Byzantine Empire for some reason. But I'm not going to use that term, even though it's the popular one, because no one used that term until like 1600. So they went to war with all these areas. They conquered much of northern Africa as well, and including Spain. And when they conquered these regions, they didn't just destroy and maim. They kept alive a lot of the old writings and knowledge from these regions. For example, the Islamic kingdoms kept alive the old Latin and Greek works, especially the stuff on arithmetic, and they also expanded upon it. There was a guy whose name was Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but anyway. In the 700s, he wrote a little book that, for everyone who hates math, you can curse this guy right now, because he wrote the book called The Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. And what this book was, is it was the first book giving a guide to the solution of linear and quadratic equations. So if you ever sat in math class struggling of how to balance an algebra equation, you have this guy to blame, because he's the reason why you have to do that. And this book would later be translated into Latin in the 1100s and would become the basis for mathematics in the West, and it would also help introduce Indian numerals into our language that are used today, 0 through 10. Before that, they'd mostly use the Roman numerals, which are you probably have seen them in little movies like Gladiator. It's like the little I is for 1 and the V is for 5. But today we use Indian numerals, and that's because of Al-Khwarizmi. And that's a pretty big development during a period that we commonly refer to as the Dark Ages. And one thing I want to bring up about this time period is that there were always people who were learning and innovating all throughout history. There's no such thing as a time period where everything just stops and no one does anything. People are always trying to develop. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that there is some truth to the idea of it being a dark age. For example, this was a time period, at least in Western Europe, that was incredibly decentralized. These new nations that took over after them did not have the centralized focus of Rome. So you'd see a lot more feudal lords and stuff like that, and lots of smaller conflicts. And also, to be honest, learning was a little bit more difficult to come by because there wasn't a centralized way to get it. If you wanted to learn how to read, you had to go to a monastery or find someone, like one of the few people who knew how to read and write. So I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk a little bit about some specific nations and people groups that emerged during the Dark Ages. And these are some groups that still impact our world today. So I think that makes them very important to look at. So the main group I'm going to talk about is called the Franks. Now, you might know them by a different name as the French, but when they first emerged on the scene, they were known as the Franks. And what these groups were is that they were a Germanic group from Western Germany, and they came onto the scene in the 300s. And just as a side note, most of the Germanic tribes that didn't end up taking land and forming their own kingdoms in Western Europe didn't really last very long. The Ostrogoths and Vandals, for example, who were established in Italy and North Africa respectively, they were both crushed by the Eastern Roman Empire and completely destroyed. And also, the Visigoths in Spain were basically annihilated by the Umayyad dynasty of North Africa, which conquered them in the 700s. And that's where the term Moor comes from, interestingly enough. They were known as the Moors who lived in Spain. And you can still see their architecture if you ever visit Spain today, especially in southern Spain. But anyway, a lot of these groups basically came and went fairly quickly. But there was one group that stuck around, and that was the Franks. So initially, in the Franks' early years in the 300s, they mainly served as the mercenaries for the Romans. Their religion was pretty similar to the Norse religion. They believed in Thor and Odin and such. And initially, they mostly lived in Germany until slowly migrating into France, which back then they didn't call it French. They called France, They referred to it as Gaul. The reason why they called it Gaul is that actually Gaelic people used to live there. Interesting side note. So as Rome basically collapsed around them, the Franks found an opportunity to really expand. And there was one guy whose name was Clovis, and who came onto the scene and became king of the Franks in 481. Clovis is a Germanic form of the name Louis. Louis, in case you didn't know, is a very, very popular name for French royalty. He went to war with several groups, including like a little old Roman remnant up in northern France, and then he fought against the Burgundians and Visigoths, and he basically kicked all of their butts and established a region that looked a lot like modern France, although it also included Western Germany. So that was his kingdom that he created, but as soon as he died, his sons divided his lands, and then there was a lot of conflict. And his dynasty became known as the Merovingian dynasty. Now, there were a couple of things that made the Franks a little bit different than the other groups, and the Romans as well. For one, they converted to Catholic Christianity pretty quickly. Clovis was the first Frank to really convert publicly, at least. So, and after that, a lot of his people followed suit. And just an interesting note about, religious conversion during this time. It would probably take a long time before the religion itself would replace all of the older practices of the other religion. And a lot of people would probably just join the king's religion just because that was what the king was doing. And a lot of them might just add this god to their collection. But over time, the old ways sort of die out. So Franks become a very strongly Catholic kingdom, quote unquote. And another thing that was different from the Franks is that their neighbors around them, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, and the Vandals, and the people like that, they really tried to keep alive all the old Roman systems, and that actually was a bad thing. For example, they tried to keep alive the very heavy taxes and the very heavy, administrative practices that the Romans had, and that made them really, really unpopular with the people they were ruling. Whereas the Franks the Franks, on the other hand, they allowed for more decentralized government. And what that came down to is they basically have, individual manors that are run by dukes or lords or people like that, who are selected more or less for their talented leadership. And this decentralization, it actually helped the Frankish nation run a little bit better because there wasn't all these severe laws coming down. Now, the Franks would continue to reign for quite some time. And there was one guy who emerged on the scene in the 700s who would create one of probably the most famous Frankish dynasty ever. This guy was named Charles Martel. Martel means the hammer. And this guy was a pretty interesting figure. So, just for some context, in the 700s, the Umayyad dynasty, an Islamic kingdom, had recently conquered Spain. And those people were also looking to raid and establish new land in France as well. So there was this invasion of France in the 730s, and Charles Martel gathered together a huge army, and there was a big battle between the Franks and the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours. And the Umayyads were completely and utterly defeated and driven off. And what's interesting about this battle is that this sort of marks the western terminus of any form of Islamic expansion, at least on the kingdom level, into Western Europe. Now, just as a caveat to this, there's been lots of discussions about how important this battle was. There's been a lot of discussions about whether this Umayyad invasion was more of a raid or anything like that. And even if the Umayyads had won, they probably wouldn't have been able to dominate France because it was just a really hard place to rule. It was very decentralized, unlike a lot of the other areas they conquered, so it would be much harder to control. But regardless, it is important battle because of what came after it. And what came after it is that Charles Martel and his boys, they basically kicked the Merovingians out of the Frankish territory, and they established themselves as the new kings. And this leads to one of the most famous monarchs in history. Charles Martel's grandson was known as Charles the Great, although you might know him better as Charlemagne. Now, this guy was one of the most famous rulers of all early medieval Europe, and for good reason. By the time he died, he had a kingdom that stretched from northern Spain, France, almost all of Germany, and most of Italy, as well as Belgium and the Netherlands. So that's a pretty impressive area, especially for a time that's known for being decentralized and having much smaller, lords and nobles and ladies ruling the land. So, this guy was originally just the king of the western half of the empire, basically France, but when his brother Carloman died, he took over the whole region. And one of the first things he did when he became king is he went to war against the Lombards. And the Lombards are yet another Germanic group that had been invading Italy recently. That's one of the funny things about this period, is that there are so many different groups, and they all tend to be Germanic in origin, that are always invading constantly. And that's why I find it interesting, the history of Germany later, how Germany went from being, this disparate group, and they continued as really this disorganized, disparate group until the 1800s, when they just become a huge behemoth. But anyway, we do see sort of elements of the Germans becoming huge during this time period. For example, Charlemagne had this huge centralized army, and this army that encompassed Germany and France. For example, he could field an army of about 150,000 men at its height, with about 35,000 of those being heavy cavalry. I'm not going to call them knights as yet, because knights as a term really wouldn't emerge until much later. That's one thing about the Dark Ages. There really aren't anything you could call knights. Yes, there are people who basically served as heavy cavalry, much like in the way that knights were, but there was nothing like the idea of chivalry. That came much, much later, after the Crusades, actually. So anyway, this army was even bigger than his neighbor, the Eastern Roman Empire, which could field maybe about 120,000. Now, Charlemagne wasn't all rainbows and roses. He could actually be a very, very brutal ruler. For example, there's a group in northern Germany at this time known as the Saxons. Now, this group is not the same as the Saxons that would later invade England. Well, they're probably related, but they're not exactly the same. But he waged a 20-year-long campaign against this group. And the reason he did it was for two reasons. One is that the Saxons really tended to raid Western Germany at this time a lot. And another was he really didn't like the fact that there were these pagans, quote-unquote, as his neighbors. So he wanted to basically force them to convert by the sword. And at one particular point, he captured a group of about 4,500 Saxons, and he told them to convert, and when they refused, he slaughtered all of them. And that's actually... There's actually a song by Christopher Lee, who is a former he died a couple years back, but he was a actor. He played Saruman in Lord of the Rings, and he also played Count Dooku in Star Wars Episode 2 and Episode 3, and he was also Count Dracula in some older movies. Anyway, he had a song where he dresses up like Charlemagne and sings about killing all these Saxons, and it's great, and you should check it out. And this slaughter of these pagan Saxons would actually be not immortalized, but it would sort of be honored later by later German nationalists in the 1800s because they look back at this, as the French, quote unquote, oppressing them. And the Nazis even established a little, memorial there, which has later been ignored because of how closely it's associated with Nazism. But Charlemagne decided that he was going to conquer them, and he did. And later in his life, he got involved with some papal politics. Now, the Roman papacy at this time, for some context, they were not as powerful as they were in the later Middle Ages. They did have a lot of sway over politics in Italy, and they certainly could influence kings, but we don't see that later papacy where they were able to just excommunicate whoever they wanted and basically get kings to kowtow towards them. Excuse me. That really wouldn't happen until after the Crusades. Which is one interesting thing to note, is just that the Catholic Church certainly had a lot of pull during the Dark Ages, but they were certainly not the behemoth we think about. There weren't inquisitors running around burning people at the stake at all time. That's not to say there wasn't religious violence. As I just said before, there certainly was, but that's just one thing to keep in mind. So anyway, in 800, there was this pope at the time whose name was Leo III. And Leo III had gotten into some trouble with politics. In the city of Rome, he had a whole lot of rivals. And they were constantly threatening that they were going to cut his tongue out, or cut his hands off, or cut his feet off, or castrate him, or something like that. And the reason why they wanted to do that is because at that time, in order to be a pope, you couldn't have a physical deformity. So they were threatening to do that, to sort of get him to kick him out. So Pope Leo III, fearing for his life, he fled north to the Frankish kingdom, and he contacted Charlemagne, and he asked him, hey, could you help me, travel with me back to Rome, then I'll be safe, and people can see you're on my side, and no one's going to mess with me. So Charlemagne agrees to do that, and it's a huge procession, and obviously before then, Charlemagne had beaten the Lombards about 26 years ago, so he was already a celebrity in Italy. And as soon as he arrived in Rome, Leo III had him crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor. So now you might be thinking to yourself, wait, wasn't the Roman Empire just destroyed 400 years ago? Well, this act was basically declaring that Charlemagne was the emperor of the revived Roman Empire. And Charlemagne, when this first happened, he was a little bit iffy about it. He sort of feigned displeasure about it. And the reason why he did that was because he really didn't want to make the Eastern Roman Emperor angry, because technically speaking, the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, again, modern-day Istanbul, had a claim to all of the Roman Empire, and technically had a claim to the lands that Charlemagne ruled. Now, again, this is a very weak claim, because without military force, you can't really claim to rule anything. But at this time, people really still had this idea that Rome was still around and it could still return at any time. So that's what happened, and he was crowned as basically the revived Roman emperor. And Charlemagne during his reign, he did a whole lot more than just conquer and kill and make empires, because anyone can do, well, not anyone can do that, but lots of people have done that, and it doesn't make them great in any way. But Charlemagne was great, quote unquote, if you want to call anyone great, because he was a patron of the arts. For example, he tried to preserve as many Latin texts as possible within the realm of, the Frankish Empire, because a lot of those texts had sort of fallen into disuse, many of them had been destroyed, and he wanted to make sure these works were preserved. And one way he did that was through educational reform. So he set up all these universities, well, not all these universities, but centers of learning where people could learn how to read and write Latin. And he himself was dedicated to learning, but unfortunately, he could never learn how to write. He could read, but writing for him was too hard because he started trying to learn how to write when he was, in his 40s and 50s. And by then, it's so difficult to learn to write when you're, especially during that age of the world, so it was pretty difficult. Even think about it, it's like learning how to write is almost like learning how to speak another language. That's why when we teach people how to write, we tend to teach them as then they're little kids because the mind is a little bit more malleable. You're more able to learn things. But even though he himself didn't learn how to write, he definitely wanted to introduce and support people who did write. And one thing that came about during his reign is something known as Carolingian minuscule. And what Carolingian minuscule is, and this is incredibly important for our modern day grammar, is that it introduced things like punctuation, cases, and spacing between words. Now, if you can imagine, writing back then was basically like the Wild West. You could pick up a piece of work and you'd be like, I don't understand what this is saying at all, because the words are all smushed together. There's no punctuation marks at all. There's no commas. Stuff is misspelled. Stuff is spelled differently. So even just trying to read this stuff can be really difficult. Well, along comes Carolingian minuscule, and now all of a sudden we have grammatical rules. Now you might think, well, who cares about grammatical rules? That's just stuff I have to learn in my writing class here at college. Well, without grammatical rules, there's no way to know how to write, and there's no way to really understand stuff. So that's a pretty big development to happen in an age we call the Dark Ages. Now, Charlemagne himself, like many emperors and conquerors at the time, after his death, his empire didn't last all that long. So, when he died, his kingdom passed to his son called Louis the Pious. They tended to give people titles like that. And Louis the Pious really wasn't focused a lot on war and conquest. He was more, a very religious guy. So he mostly wanted to pray and do things like that. But when Louis the Pious died, he had 3 sons. And because of the way Frankish inheritance law worked, it wasn't like the eldest who inherited. The entire state was split even 3 ways between the 3 descendants. Now, this has caused a lot of problems for kingdoms throughout the ages that had this law, because it basically made it almost impossible for there to be any centralization. And whenever this would happen, inevitably the kids would end up fighting. And that's exactly what happened. And also, the way this area was split is incredibly weird. Excuse me. It was split into West, Middle, and Eastern Francia. And the western part is basically France. The eastern part is basically Germany. But the middle part doesn't make any sense at all. It's this long strip of land from Belgium running down the border all the way through Italy. And this area was very quickly conquered by the other 2 brothers. But this divide is very interesting, because this one event in history really created the divide between France and Germany. And it also sort of established the border conflicts they had, because, before this, France and Germany were basically one kingdom, the Frankish kingdom. And after that, they would be separate, and they never really join again. And the West Frank side eventually became, heavily Latinized. They started to speak French, became a very Latinized language, whereas German became, it was a Germanic language. So it's very interesting, when we look at nations and the history of the world and see how just little things like this can shape the world in incredibly huge ways. Now, the Franks weren't the only group during the Dark Ages that were doing very interesting things. There were other groups, for example, like the little sliver of northern Spain that basically survived the Umayyad invasion, became northern Spain, and they did a whole lot of stuff. And obviously southern Spain under the Moors had created some great architecture and very beautiful civilization. But there's another group that we know somewhat well, because we've probably heard the term used a lot, and that were the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons, who they were for reference, they were basically, once again, a Germanic group. It feels like I'm beating a dead horse here, but that's pretty much where they all came from during this time. And that they were from northern Germany and modern-day Denmark. And they came over, they sailed across the sea and invaded modern-day England, which was ruled by basically the Romans, but the Romans had really abandoned it by the 400s. And they invaded England, and eventually these areas slowly but surely conquered it. Just as a side note, that's kind of the legend of King Arthur comes from this time period, because there's a legend about this Romano-British guy who helped fight against the Saxon invasions, and that's where we get all the King Arthur stuff, but that's for another episode. So the Saxons conquer England, and they eventually convert to Christianity, like most of these groups did, and after a few hundred years, the Saxons undergo a little bit of a renaissance. And one aspect of this renaissance was their beautiful manuscripts that they wrote. One example is they would make these beautiful gospel manuscripts. And a good example of this is the Lindisfarne Gospel. And this gospel was made they put text on the vellum or parchments, they wrote all that down, and then they would illustrate the text using paints made from plant dyes, chemical compounds, and flakes of metal to just make these beautiful pieces of art or letters to go on top of it. And then the whole thing was bound in leather, and sometimes they'd have gold on the end of it. And so these monasteries would become huge centers of learning. Now, they would also write interesting stories beyond just, copying the Bible. They famously someone wrote the tale of Beowulf. And what Beowulf is this is a story actually set in Denmark, and it's about this guy, this Viking dude named Beowulf, who helps this king fight off this monster called Grendel. Then he later becomes a king and helps fight Grendel's mother, and then later dies fighting a dragon. And this is actually kind of interesting because this story shows us that the Saxons still remembered that they originally came from Denmark. So this story was written in about the 700s. So you really get to see how the Saxon civilization was not just this static thing or this barbaric society. Although they did have barbaric practices and evil things, don't get me wrong. They believed very strongly in slavery, for example. But the Saxon civilization did start to have some problems when they were attacked by our old buddies, the Vikings. So that Lindisfarne place that made that gospel that I just described a minute ago, because it was a monastery and most people around them were Christian, they really didn't have anything to protect themselves with, because they're like, well, everyone's Christian. No one's going to attack a monastery. Well, the Viking pagans just saw they had a lot of gold, so they didn't care. So they went into Lindisfarne, killed a whole bunch of the monks, destroyed a whole bunch of the manuscripts, and took away a lot of these priceless golden artifacts to basically melt down for gold. And they also destroyed a lot of other monasteries throughout England, and these were centers of learning. So the Vikings would raid England, or these Saxon areas, from about the 700s to about the 1000s. But there was one Saxon guy, who helped fight against them, and his name was Alfred the Great. And he was the king of Wessex, which was the southernmost part of England. All the Saxon kingdoms were not united in any way. And he helped fund off the Vikings, and he helped revitalize Saxon law and education after all these Danish raids had basically destroyed it. Although he once famously lamented that learning had basically ground to a halt because of it. And he decided that he was going to really try to emphasize learning amongst the male population. And yes, unfortunately, I say the male population. This was not really a time of gender equality. So he wrote that he wanted to set to learning, as long as they're not useful for some other employment, of all the freeborn young men now in England. So we've seen how there have been lots of civilizations that sort of emerge in the Dark Ages, which were not, these weren't, I hate to use this word, but they weren't primitive civilizations in any means. And when I say primitive, I recognize that word is incredibly misused, and it's incredibly biased, and it's often used in an incredibly racist way. But that term is also used in an incredibly biased way towards the Dark Ages civilizations, because these were not just places empty of learning and empty of all development. These were some pretty interesting civilizations that created things that we still use today. I mean, they created punctuation that we still use today, arithmetic, all sorts of things. So whenever anyone next time claims that there was such a thing called the Dark Ages, just remind them, well, they weren't that dark. I mean, they had some torches. I'm sorry, I'm just full of really bad dad jokes today. So I wanted to thank you all for joining me today. Hopefully Katie will be feeling better soon and we can get her back for some next episodes. But thank you so much for joining us for the Dank History Show. I love having you all here. And if you're interested in following us on social media, you can follow us on Twitter. We are at History Dank. That's capital H, capital D, HISTORY, capital D, ANK. And that's on Twitter. You can follow us for some interesting dank content. And the next week when we come back, we're probably going to be focusing on some alternate history. And that's stuff like, well, what would happen if this one event changed? What would happen if we went back in time and killed Hitler as a baby? How would things change? Very interesting questions. So anyway, thank you all for joining us. Once again,